Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. It was an unremarkable afternoon when Alex, Sam, and Maria found themselves drawn to the decrepit building on the outskirts of town. From a distance, it looked like any other abandoned structure, tall, imposing, its windows like empty eyes staring into the nothingness of the forest surrounding it. But as they stepped closer, an unsettling pull seemed to tug at them, coaxing them towards the entryway. The old, wooden door creaked as Alex pushed it open. It was dark inside, but the musty scent of mildew and the faint aroma of something aged and forgotten permeated the air. This was supposed to be a simple exploration, a quick jaunt through an abandoned building, something to distract them from the monotony of their daily lives. Yet, the silence that greeted them made them feel as though they were intruding on something far older and far more sinister than they had anticipated. Alex had always been the one to take charge, the one who could always calm nerves with a quick word or a calm gesture. Tall, with short-cropped dark hair and an expression that was often set in a permanent frown of concentration, Alex was the most put together of the group. He had a level-headed approach to everything. Whether it was an impromptu road trip or navigating through the inevitable tension between friends, Alex was the anchor. At 28, Alex was the kind of person who prided themselves on practicality. As they stood in the doorway of the abandoned building, they were already mapping out the plan in their head. There had been rumors about this place, something about a missing family, a strange disappearance of travelers, but to Alex, it was just that, rumors. It's probably just another abandoned house, you know? Alex said, forcing a smile to reassure Maria, who seemed hesitant. Let's just take a look inside. We won't be here long. He led the way into the darkness, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. The building had been in this state for decades, maybe longer. The peeling wallpaper, the crumbling flooring, and the distant creaks all hinted that this place had stories to tell. But Alex wasn't thinking about that. His mind was too practical. He was here to prove something to himself and to his friends. To show that he could take risks and still control the situation. Alex's need for control was more than just about exploring old buildings, it was a deep-seated part of his personality. It had been this way for as long as he could remember. He wasn't good with uncertainty. He wasn't good at not knowing what was next. Maria, at 26, was a stark contrast to Alex. Small in stature, with long, unruly brown hair that she was constantly pushing away from her face, she had a nervous energy about her. She was the type who felt the weight of a room the moment she stepped in, and could sense when something was amiss, even before anyone else did. Maria was the kind of person who'd call her mom if she saw a shadow in the corner of her room. She trusted her instincts deeply, and more often than not, those instincts were right. Her emotions ran deep, sometimes too deep, and her sensitivity was both her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. As they entered the building, Maria hesitated, glancing around. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the quiet was unsettling. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, a subconscious attempt to shield herself from the creeping sense of dread that had begun to settle over her. "I don't know about this, Alex," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked around the dark interior. "Something feels wrong." Alex waved her off, clearly unfazed. "It's fine, Maria. We're just looking around. Nothing's going to happen." But Maria wasn't so sure. The house felt alive in a way she couldn't explain, like it was watching them. The longer she stayed, the more her skin began to crawl. Sam was the most detached from the whole experience. He had agreed to come because Alex insisted, and Maria seemed too nervous to go alone, but Sam wasn't expecting much. At 30, he was the oldest of the group, but it wasn't age that made him different, it was his worldview. Sam wasn't the kind of person to believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that nonsense. To him, this was just another pointless adventure to kill time. He rolled his eyes at Maria's unease and Alex's overly rational reassurances. "I'm pretty sure you're both overthinking this," Sam remarked dryly, standing near the back of the group. His arms were crossed, and he had a perpetual smirk on his face. "It's just an old building. Nothing more. No haunted nonsense." Sam's skepticism was both a strength and a flaw. He could handle situations with a level of detachment that sometimes irritated those around him. He believed that everything could be explained with science, logic, or reason. This made him dismissive of anything supernatural, including the strange sensations that were beginning to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness as they climbed deeper into the building. "Let's just get this over with," Sam added, shaking his head as Alex pushed forward. "I'm starving." The building was an old manor that had once been home to a wealthy family. Now, its halls were empty, save for the dust and the creaking of floorboards underfoot. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, faded and worn by years of neglect. It seemed as though time had stopped here, leaving nothing behind but echoes of what once was. As they moved through the building, they found themselves standing before an old, dilapidated staircase. The air felt heavy as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting. Alex led the way again, confidently stepping onto the first step. Maria followed, hesitantly, her gaze darting around the darkened hallway. Sam, with his usual bravado, walked behind them, his mind already wandering to what he could snack on once they finished this ridiculous adventure. The staircase spiraled upward, its worn steps creaking with every movement. The higher they climbed, the more they felt the weight of something, watching them. It wasn't just the stillness of the house anymore, it was the feeling of being observed, of being trapped in a place where nothing seemed to make sense. As they reached the top of the stairs, a strange door caught their attention. It stood ajar, the faintest glimmer of light seeping through the crack. It was a door unlike any other, they hadn't seen it before, not when they first entered the building. It was as though it had materialized from nowhere. When did that open?" Sam asked, looking at Alex and Maria, who both seemed confused. Neither of them had noticed the door before, yet here it was, inviting them to step closer. Alex's curiosity flared. "Maybe it's just an old door that's been there the whole time. Let's see where it leads." Maria, feeling a rising tide of unease, glanced nervously at Sam, but he was already moving toward the door. She wasn't sure why, but she had a sense that they shouldn't open it. Something wasn't right about it. "Guys." Maria's voice faltered, but it was too late. Alex had already turned the knob and was pushing the door open. Behind it lay another staircase, this one darker and steeper. And as they stepped through the doorway, the world they knew began to shift. The small group of friends had, at first, been excited about their exploration of the abandoned building, with its looming facade and forgotten mysteries. But as they ventured deeper, that excitement began to fade into something else, a vague sense of disquiet, an undercurrent of fear that none of them could quite put into words. Each step up the staircase seemed to deepen their unease, though none of them could fully articulate why. It was only when they reached the top that they truly began to understand something was wrong. Alex was the first to reach the top of the stairs, his foot landing with a soft thud as he stepped onto the next level. The hallway ahead stretched out before him, but it was narrower than it should have been, almost like the space was warping. He paused, frowning at the sight. It felt like he had seen it before, this narrow corridor, the peculiar paintings on the walls, the old, dusty furniture, but there was something off about it. The air felt stale, suffocating, and the floorboards creaked in a way that made it sound as though they were groaning under the weight of something far heavier than just the three of them. "Everything okay?" Sam's voice broke through the silence, his tone casual, though there was an edge of skepticism. He had been following behind them, and now stood just a few paces away, looking around in the dim light from Alex's flashlight. "Yeah, it's fine," Alex said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. He turned to face Maria, who was still a few steps behind. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something like fear. "You good?" Maria didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze flitted nervously to the end of the corridor, where a door stood ajar so quietly that it could have been mistaken for an illusion. But the longer she stared at it, the more she felt its presence. It was an old wooden door, battered and scarred, and yet, something about the way it stood there slightly open, beckoning them, seemed unnatural. "I don't know about this, guys," Maria finally said, her voice shaky. "I swear I saw that door closed just a second ago." Alex glanced at the door, but he was still focused on the task at hand. He had no patience for superstition. "It's probably just an old door that's been left open." "It's nothing, Maria." Maria wasn't convinced. She had always been sensitive to these kinds of things, and the air in this place had begun to feel heavier, like an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. Every step she took seemed to take her deeper into an unsettling haze, a fog of uncertainty. Sam, seeing her hesitation, rolled his eyes. "Come on, Maria. It's just a door. Don't let your imagination run wild." But as they all moved closer to the door, Maria's discomfort only grew. There was something behind it. Something pulling her forward, despite the voice inside her telling her to turn around. She could almost hear a faint whisper, like a soft murmur echoing from the other side. The sound was so distant that she could hardly be sure if it was real. Alex didn't seem to notice, his focus on the door as he carefully pushed it open. The hinges creaked loudly, and the moment the door fully opened, the atmosphere seemed to change. The room on the other side of the door was unlike anything they had expected. Beyond the door was another staircase. But it wasn't like the one they had just ascended. This one seemed wrong. The stairs were not uniform. Some were wider than others, and some seemed to slope downward ever so slightly, giving the entire staircase an unsettling tilt. The walls around them were dark, covered in shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The wooden balustrades were chipped and worn, and the wallpaper, faded floral patterns, peeled in places, revealing a faint, damp smell beneath. "Ah, this is weird," Alex muttered, his flashlight scanning over the staircase. "I don't remember this being here. This place doesn't feel right." Maria felt her heart race in her chest. She had never been so sure of anything before. This wasn't just a staircase. It was a trap. A staircase that led to nowhere. It was as if the house was actively trying to disorient them. She turned back to Sam. "Sam, this doesn't look like the same house anymore. How is there another staircase? Why would it be here?" Sam shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I'm starting to get a bad feeling about this. It's like this whole place is shifting when we're not looking." They all hesitated, staring at the staircase, a strange sense of dread creeping over them. The strange details only continued to accumulate as they made their way up the new staircase. Every turn, every step forward, left them feeling more unsettled. Alex had taken the lead again, though his usual bravado was slipping. The further they climbed, the more disoriented he felt. The staircase seemed endless, stretching far longer than it should have. His eyes darted up the darkened stairs, but the higher they climbed, the less confident he felt about the layout of the house. At one point, the stairs seemed to double back on themselves, making it appear as though they were climbing in a circle. It was an optical illusion, something that didn't make sense, but the more Alex stared, the more his mind tried to make it make sense, twisting reality into something that didn't hold up. When he turned back to check on the others, something in his gut clenched. The momentary relief he'd felt earlier evaporated, replaced with an overwhelming sense of dread. Sam had disappeared. "Sam!" Alex called out. There was no response. Maria's voice broke through the tension. "What do you mean Sam is gone? He was right behind us." Alex turned around, his heartbeat quickening. He had been sure Sam was with them. But now, it was just him and Maria, standing alone at the top of the staircase. He spun around, frantic, scanning the space behind them. There was no sign of Sam, no indication that he had even been there moments ago. I don't understand," Alex muttered, his voice shaky for the first time since entering the building. Maria stepped back, her hands trembling. This isn't right. We need to get out of here. We have to leave." But the staircase stretched on endlessly in front of them, taunting them with its shifting form, and the doors behind them had vanished into the same oppressive darkness. No way forward. No way back. As if to confirm their worst fears, a low sound started to echo through the staircase, an eerie, almost imperceptible hum. At first, it was so soft they could barely hear it, like the murmur of wind passing through the walls. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew louder, until it became a constant hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into their bones. Maria's heart began to pound, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide with fear. Alex nodded slowly. The hum felt alive, like something was feeding off their fear. His breath quickened, and for a moment, He thought he saw something dark, moving at the edge of his vision, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. "Something's wrong," he said, more to himself than to Maria. This is a nightmare." The discovery of the staircase was the beginning of the unraveling of their reality. Strange details that shouldn't have existed, missing people, optical illusions, and that eerie hum pushed the protagonists into a psychological maelstrom. With each passing step, they lost more of their grasp on reality, and the maze-like staircase took hold of their minds. Now, as they continued their ascent or descent into the unknown, they couldn't tell where the staircase would lead. They could only hope that they hadn't crossed a point of no return. The more Alex, Sam, and Maria ascended the staircase, the more it seemed to distort before them. What had initially seemed like a straightforward exploration had become a nightmare from which they couldn't escape. Each step upwards felt heavier, like they were being dragged deeper into something not entirely physical, but psychological, something beyond the grasp of reason. They'd been walking for what felt like hours when they noticed the first major distortion. Sam, who had been trailing behind Maria and Alex, pointed at the wall to their left. "Look at this," he said, his voice tinged with unease. Alex turned, following Sam's gaze. At first, it was nothing more than the peeling wallpaper, darkened by years of neglect, the mildew scent growing stronger the higher they climbed. But then, in the midst of the walls covered with shadowy stains, Alex saw something that made his stomach twist. On the wall, a row of clocks had appeared, old-fashioned analog clocks with rusted metal hands. Their faces were yellowed, their numbers faded. They were set to different times, but none of them seemed to be moving. At first, Alex thought it was a trick of the light. But when he stepped closer, his breath caught. The clocks, every single one, were ticking. He could hear the distinct sound of the second hands moving in rapid succession. Tick, tick, tick. But the hands didn't move in sync with the sound. They moved at different speeds, as if each clock was caught in a loop of its own, counting down to something inevitable. Maria stepped back, visibly shaken. "This isn't normal," she whispered. This doesn't make any sense." Alex could feel his pulse quicken. He turned away from the clocks, hoping to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over him. But no matter how fast they walked, they couldn't seem to escape the ticking, which had begun to echo through the air, reverberating inside his skull. As they continued climbing the staircase, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, more suffocating. Their breaths became labored, as if the atmosphere itself was pushing against their lungs. They paused for a moment, all of them trying to regain their bearings. It was Maria who broke the silence first. Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex had been too focused on the distorted clocks to hear anything. But as soon as Maria spoke, a strange, soft whisper reached his ears. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, swirling around them like an unseen storm. The sound was unsettling, a low murmur that seemed to come from every direction at once. It felt like someone, or something, was speaking to them, whispering words they couldn't quite make out. Maria's eyes darted around the staircase, scanning the shadows, but there was no one. Nothing. Sam looked at them both, his face pale. "I hear it too. What is that? Where is it coming from?" The whispers intensified. The voices seemed to call their names. Alex could hear his own name in the mix, but it was twisted, distorted, not quite his voice. "Alex! Alex!" The whispers repeated over and over, until they started to bleed into each other, becoming a cacophony that drowned out everything else. I don't like this," Maria said, panic creeping into her voice. "I need to leave. Now." But as they turned to descend the staircase, they found the way blocked. The stairs that had been behind them were gone. In their place was only an impenetrable black void, as though the staircase had never existed at all. They were trapped. Feeling the walls closing in, Alex moved toward the door at the top of the staircase, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But the moment he touched the door, an unseen force gripped him. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, a slight pressure against his hand. But as he tried to pull away, the force grew stronger, a cold, clammy feeling that crept up his arm. His fingers went numb as the pressure intensified. "Get off me," Alex cried, trying to wrench his hand free, But the more he fought, the tighter the grip seemed to become. His breath was shallow now, panic setting in as he struggled to breathe. "Alex!" Maria screamed, rushing to his side. But the closer she got to him, the more she felt the air itself pushing her back, as though the space around them was alive, rejecting her presence. Alex could barely move his arm, and the skin where the unseen force had gripped him was starting to burn. A faint, sharp sensation flared through his veins, and he gasped. It felt as if something was draining the life from him, feeding off his fear. "Help him!" Maria cried to Sam, who had been standing frozen, watching in horror. But Sam didn't move. He couldn't move. His body felt like it had been rooted to the ground, unwilling or unable to intervene. Alex's vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, faint and indistinct, standing at the edge of his vision. It was as though it were watching them. But before he could focus, the presence, whatever it was, disappeared. The force loosened, and Alex's arm fell to his side. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, his pulse racing. He stumbled back, shaken, as the echoes of the whispers grew louder, drowning out all rational thought. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered, his voice shaking. Alex shook his head. I don't know. I thought I saw something. Something that was watching us." The longer they stood there, the more disorienting the staircase became. The distorted clocks on the walls now appeared to be multiplying, each ticking faster than the last, like a fevered countdown to something inevitable. The lights above them flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch and curl at odd angles. The air itself seemed to warp, creating an unsettling ripple of heat and cold, as if the room was physically shifting around them. Sam reached for his phone. He'd been holding it in his pocket the entire time, but now seemed like the right time to check it, maybe it could offer some grounding. He unlocked it quickly, but the screen was blank. No signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around them. "This doesn't make any sense," Sam muttered, tapping the phone, trying to force it to respond. Maria, ever the skeptic, pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to steady her breathing. "We need to get out of here. This is too much." "How?" Alex's voice cracked, his eyes wild. "How do we leave when the way is blocked? When everything is wrong?" The staircase around them felt increasingly alien. Each step now seemed to shift with every footfall, as if the very stairs underfoot were part of the distortion. The entire place seemed to be alive, shifting around them with every passing second, manipulating reality, pulling them deeper into its grasp. They weren't just trapped in a building anymore. They were trapped in a nightmare, a dream that shifted, twisted, and distorted to reflect their worst fears. The whispers grew louder still, now a constant hum that filled their ears, drowning out all other thoughts. The air thickened with an oppressive pressure that made each breath feel like a struggle. Alex looked around, his mind spiraling, as the world around him seemed to fracture. Time no longer made sense. The walls, once sturdy and secure, now appeared to be made of paper, flimsy and insubstantial. The staircase beneath them felt hollow, as though they were floating, suspended between two worlds. The floor beneath them wavered as if it could crumble at any moment, sending them plummeting into the darkness below. "Please, we need to leave," Maria begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to go before it's too late." But no matter how far they walked, no matter how fast they ascended, it felt like the staircase stretched on forever. The top seemed to be just out of reach, as though the universe itself was testing their resolve. It was clear now. The staircase wasn't a structure. It was a prison. It wasn't a passage. It was a trap. The fear that had been building inside them, that slow sense of dread that had been gnawing at the edges of their minds, was now a palpable presence surrounding them, suffocating them, feeding off their every moment of doubt. As they continued their climb, they understood one thing with terrifying clarity: there was no escape. There never had been. The staircase would never end. Alex, Sam, and Maria's footsteps had slowed, and the oppressive weight of fear began to feel like an anchor tied to their bodies. No longer able to ignore the pull of dread at their heels, they were caught between a deep, suffocating panic and the impossibly distant goal of reaching the end of the staircase. It had started as a mere inconvenience, a puzzle, an anomaly in their perception of reality, but now, each step felt like an anchor, dragging them further into a nightmare that had no escape. The air was thick with humidity, sticky against their skin, and the scent of mildew was stronger than ever. The flickering lights, growing dimmer with every passing moment, seemed to whisper in the dark. The shadows stretched unnaturally on the walls, bending like living things, creeping just beyond the edge of their vision. Even though they had climbed for what seemed like hours, there was no sign of a change, no promise of a door or an exit. Nothing. They were trapped in a loop, a cycle of endless ascent with no end in sight. It was as though time had lost its meaning here, the passage of minutes, hours, or days irrelevant to the madness that gripped their minds. I can't take this anymore, Sam muttered, his voice weak and shaking. His hand gripped the railing tightly as though it might give him some illusion of control. But the more he looked around, the more he felt that the very staircase itself was pressing in on him. The walls felt closer, tighter, and the faint smell of rot lingered in the air, a constant reminder that they weren't just trapped in a physical sense, but in something deeper, more primal. Alex couldn't even look at Sam. He was hyper-aware of the sensation of being watched, the feeling that someone or something was behind them, following them. Every time he dared glance over his shoulder, the staircase behind them seemed to stretch into nothingness. It felt like an abyss, as though the staircase had erased everything that had come before it. "What are we doing here?" Maria's voice broke through the silence, a bitter, desperate edge to her words. She clutched the railing, too, as though grounding herself would allow her to regain some sense of agency. But there was no comfort in the cold metal. "There's nothing. There's no way out." Alex gritted his teeth, his eyes darting from one distorted clock on the wall to another. Time seemed irrelevant now, like a warped concept, ticking away but not in any meaningful way. The clock's hands spun wildly, sometimes in reverse, sometimes at a feverish pace, sometimes frozen altogether, as if mocking their attempts to understand the passage of time. He reached for his phone, but again, there was no signal. He couldn't even escape into the distraction of technology, something he had relied on countless times before. "Please, we need to keep moving," Alex said, his voice cracking as he spoke. "We can't stop." Maria shot him a look, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had been silently falling apart for the past few hours, her panic eating away at her rationality. "I don't even know what direction we're going anymore," she whispered. "Is there even a top to this place? Or are we just walking, forever?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the universe to provide an answer. But there was no answer, only the same relentless staircase, stretching up, down, and around them with no end in sight. Suddenly, the air grew colder, a gust of wind that wasn't natural. It felt like something unseen had just brushed past them, cold and sharp. A horrible crackling sound echoed around them. They all froze. The hairs on the back of Alex's neck stood on end. What was that? Sam's voice trembled. "I don't know," Alex whispered, trying to steady his breath. His fingers were trembling as he wiped sweat from his forehead. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the heat of their earlier panic now replaced by an eerie chill. They could see their breath as they exhaled, fog rising in the air around them. But this cold wasn't like the winter chill, it was something ancient, something unnatural. At the far end of the staircase, Alex thought he saw a figure standing in the darkness. His heart skipped a beat, and he froze, wide-eyed. The figure was cloaked in shadows, and yet, it felt tangible, real, as if it had always been there. The air seemed to hum with the figure's presence. He reached out to touch Maria's arm, but when he looked back, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" he asked, voice tight with fear. Maria didn't reply. Her eyes were locked forward, staring at something Alex couldn't see. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Sam, his voice barely audible, muttered something about needing to get out. But as they continued to climb, the air grew thicker still, and the walls of the staircase seemed to close in even tighter. The lights flickered again, the brightness of the bulbs dimming to an almost impossible level, casting only the faintest glow over the endless steps beneath their feet. Suddenly, the laughter rang out, soft at first, like the wind whispering through trees. But as it grew louder, Alex realized that it wasn't the wind at all. The laughter was human. Or at least it sounded human. The sound was coming from behind them, no, all around them. They weren't alone on this staircase. They never had been. I can't do this anymore, Sam choked out, his body trembling with the weight of an unseen force that seemed to be growing stronger. We need to find a way out. I can't breathe. I can't think. The laughter grew, punctuated by sounds that weren't laughter at all, but low, guttural growls. The walls around them trembled. The staircase began to shift, the steps groaning as if the very structure of the place was alive and waking up. The air grew heavier, suffocating. Maria screamed. She grabbed Alex's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. Something's wrong, something's coming for us. Her voice was raw with terror. Alex looked down, and the steps beneath their feet began to change. The familiar staircase had shifted into something darker, something more sinister. The stairs were now jagged, uneven, as if they had been made by something that had no concept of symmetry or logic. The gaps between them seemed wider now, as though each step had been stretched impossibly apart. Alex felt it then, the sensation of being pulled downward, as though the very ground beneath them was refusing to let them ascend any further. It was as if the staircase was pushing back, rejecting them, punishing them for even daring to try and leave. No, Sam cried out, trying to back away from the unyielding darkness. But the shadows reached out for him, pulling at him like invisible hands. Maria screamed, her eyes wide, her body stiff with fear. The pressure was overwhelming. It was as if the staircase was no longer just a structure, but a sentient being, a force that sought to trap them, consume them, make them part of its endless cycle. The laughter continued, now joined by other sounds, scraping noises, whispers, and the echo of distant footsteps. The staircase was no longer just a place, it had become something else entirely. A living nightmare. A trap. A force that would never let them escape. Alex, now frantic, tried to push against the air, to shove away the dark force that was closing in around them. We can't go back, he shouted, desperation in his voice. We have to keep going forward. There has to be a way out. But his words fell into the abyss of silence. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how fast they moved, the staircase seemed to stretch endlessly, consuming their energy, their hope, their very will to escape. Maria collapsed onto the steps, clutching her chest, gasping for air. Sam's eyes were wide, his mind unraveling. Please, he whispered, barely audible. Please, someone, help us. But the staircase was silent now, save for the occasional groan of the walls, the faint whisper of distant footsteps. Time felt irrelevant. There was no going forward, no going back. And as they stood there, trapped in the impossible space, the final truth became clear. They were never meant to leave. This place, this staircase, it was their end. The moment they stepped onto it, they had crossed a line. They were never meant to escape. They were part of the staircase now, trapped in its endless loop, forever climbing, forever descending, forever lost. The end would never come. And so, the story ended, not with a resolution, but with the terrifying realization that there was no escape from the endless staircase. The staircase creaked and groaned as Alex, Sam, and Maria staggered onward, though they were barely aware of the steps they took anymore. Their legs felt like lead, their movements mechanical. Every breath was shallow, every heartbeat felt out of place. Time, whatever it meant here, was nothing more than a constant, suffocating presence, one that surrounded them like the very walls of the staircase. The silence was deafening, broken only by the far-off echoes of their own movements and the oppressive sound of their pounding hearts. Alex had no idea how long it had been since they started climbing. Hours. Days. Perhaps even longer. The air was thick with a static charge, like the universe itself was about to shatter. Every moment bled into the next, and the sensation of falling into the very essence of the staircase itself deepened with every step. Please, Maria whispered, her voice strained. I can't keep going like this. I can't. Her words cut through the air, and for the first time, Alex understood that Maria was no longer just physically exhausted. She was losing herself, her sense of identity, of purpose, all slipping away like the shadowy shapes that twisted in the edges of their vision. She wasn't just asking for a break. She was asking for escape. And with each passing moment, it became harder to differentiate between the real world they once knew and the nightmarish descent they were trapped in. Alex swallowed hard. He tried to keep his voice steady, but even he could feel the panic beginning to break free from its tight hold. "We're getting closer," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was lying to her, or to himself. The staircase felt endless. There was no logical explanation for it. The air around them seemed to pulse with a strange energy that grew heavier the further they climbed. The walls felt like they were narrowing around them, the ceiling lowering, as if the very space they occupied was shrinking. And yet, the staircase stretched on, impossibly long, stretching up, down, side to side. The structure itself was an enigma, a riddle that kept shifting beneath their feet. Was there even an end? Or were they fated to climb forever? Behind them, Sam had gone silent. His earlier panic had been replaced by a kind of hollow despair, a resignation that weighed heavy on his shoulders. He had once been the strong one, the one who believed they would find a way out. But now, with each step they took, his resolve seemed to fracture further. The smile he once wore had vanished, replaced by a constant expression of helplessness. The terror in his eyes was palpable. "I can't do it anymore," Sam muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "It doesn't make sense anymore. None of it does. It's all wrong." Alex turned to face him, his heart sinking. They couldn't stop now. They couldn't afford to. He forced himself to focus, trying to block out the growing sense of hopelessness. He could feel the suffocating weight of the silence creeping up behind them, clawing at their minds. The walls, the air, the sounds, everything felt wrong. But if they stopped, if they let it consume them? "No," Alex said with determination, though it felt hollow. "We have to keep going. We're almost there." But deep down, he felt the same doubt creeping into his own thoughts. Was there really an end? Or was this just a trap, a cycle they would never escape? As they continued on, something began to shift in the air, an unmistakable change. A presence, dark and oppressive, seemed to fill the space between them. It wasn't the walls that were closing in now, but something subtler, more sinister. The laughter, once faint, grew louder, a mocking, hollow sound that echoed through the space, drowning out any thoughts of escape. "I hear it," Sam whispered, his voice shaking. "It's watching us." Maria's breath caught in her throat. "What is it?" Alex didn't answer. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to focus on the task at hand. But the moment his eyelids fluttered closed, a horrible truth settled in his chest. There was no end. There was no escape. The staircase didn't just lead upward, it trapped them in a loop, a never-ending cycle of despair. A dark figure loomed in his mind's eye. It was familiar, though Alex couldn't place it. It was as though this presence had always been with them, watching from the shadows. Watching their every move, listening to every word. He could feel the pressure of its gaze. The oppressive feeling grew stronger, more suffocating. "What do we do?" Maria's voice was barely more than a whisper, her face pale with terror. She sounded fragile, lost. She was right. What could they do? Alex felt a wave of panic rise within him. A rising tide of horror, thick and suffocating, threatening to drown him in its depths. His heartbeat quickened. He felt himself falling, spinning out of control. And as the staircase twisted further, the world around him seemed to fracture. The walls began to pulse, shifting between shades of red and black, the colors of danger, of warning. He couldn't think clearly anymore. The pressure of the endless climb, the need to escape, it was overwhelming. He turned to Sam, desperation etched on his face. "Do you see it? There's no way out. It's not just the staircase, it's everything. We've become part of it. We have to make a choice." The silence that followed was suffocating. Maria glanced nervously at both of them. "What choice?" she asked, her voice strained. Alex swallowed. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He didn't know what was real anymore, what was right. His mind was unraveling. But there was one thing he knew for sure. They had a choice. Even if it didn't feel like it. "I think we're trapped in a loop," Alex said, trying to steady his breath, though his words came out ragged. "But maybe the staircase is trying to teach us something." Sam shook his head violently. There's no lesson. There's no escape. We're just stuck here. He looked down at the steps beneath them, trembling. Maria's voice cut through the tension like a knife. No. There's always a way out. You just have to make the choice. Alex stood frozen, his mind reeling with the implications of what she said. She was right. Perhaps the escape wasn't external. Perhaps they had to choose to leave, choose to break the cycle themselves. They had to reclaim their own sense of self, of control. The staircase may have trapped them physically, but it couldn't control their will. They couldn't let it. But the idea of escaping, of confronting what lay beyond the staircase, was just as terrifying as staying trapped in it forever. What lay on the other side? What would it cost to break free? Sam's voice was a low murmur, as if coming from far away. I don't know if I can do it. I can't leave. It feels like I'll lose everything. And that was it, wasn't it? To escape, they had to face the unknown. They had to face the terror of leaving behind what they had known, what they had become, trapped, controlled. They had to choose to confront their own fears, their own selves. With trembling hands, Alex finally spoke. We leave now. Together. Or we stay here, trapped forever. Maria nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears, but also with something else. Hope. Maybe. Sam hesitated for a moment. But finally, with a deep breath, he whispered, okay. Together. Let's go. The moment they stepped forward, the staircase seemed to shudder, the walls groaning as if something deep within them was awakening. The air crackled with tension, and for the first time, Alex felt the weight lifting, just a little. Maybe, just maybe, they had made the right choice. But as the light at the end of the staircase flickered on, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The choice of escape had been made. But the story of the endless staircase would not end there. The resolution is not one of finality, it's the realization that escaping the loop is not about physical escape, but the reclamation of self. The staircase may have twisted them, terrorized them, but in the end, they had to choose to take control and break the endless cycle.